get started on an overview for what we're going to cover today, we want to go ahead and start just by covering some of the regulatory requirements that are out there for comparing the leasing option for your fleet to the owning option. We'll go ahead and talk about some of the differences, comparisons between owning a vehicle and leasing a vehicle from GSA Fleet. Talk about some of the evaluation of some of the fleet replacement strategies that we looked at in the NRCS. And then we'll get into some of the specifics of our own leasing conversion that we went through over the last year or so. Talk about our process. We'll talk about some of the lessons learned, share with you some of our fleet stats, and then also just go over some of our ongoing replacement efforts for this year, and then we'll end with a summary and some questions. So that's it for me for right now. I just wanted to get us started, and then I'm going to turn it over to Scott, and he's going to take it from here.
All right. Well, thank you, Adam, and thank you, everybody, for joining us today. The first thing we're going to cover is the requirement to conduct a lease versus buy analysis. And this requirement is actually written into the GSA Federal Management Regulation, or FMR, Bulletin B30, which is entitled Vehicle Allocation Methodology. And here it says that you must develop a fleet management plan that describes how your agency will achieve its optimal fleet inventory. Agency's fleet management plans must consider and address the following items. And then it lists a bunch of requirements, but under the heading of Section C, it says vehicle sourcing decisions for purchasing and owning vehicles compared with leasing vehicles through GSA Fleet or commercially. When comparing cost of owned vehicles to leased vehicles, compare all direct and indirect costs projected for the life cycle of owned vehicles to the total lease costs over an identical life cycle, and include your rationale for acquiring vehicles from other than the most cost-effective sources. So talking about indirect and direct costs, a lot of the services that the GSA provides along with their fleet leasing program cover some of the indirect costs, which are those management functions which are borne across the entire fleet that oftentimes folks don't take into consideration, is the amount of staff time and the amount of back-end services that are required to run the fleet. Next slide, please. So we'll cover a comparison here between different aspects of owning and leasing from GSA Fleet. For those fleets that own their vehicles, the capital costs of vehicles are paid up front, and you would get some used asset sales proceeds at the end of life of the vehicle. So that means that, say you're buying a vehicle for $30,000, and at some point in the future you may sell it for $5,000. You have to spend that $30,000 up front in order to get the benefit of using that vehicle. For GSA Fleet Leasing, the capital costs are covered through monthly payments. So in most cases, there's not going to be a huge upfront penalty or cost for buying that vehicle, but rather those costs are spread out over time. Agency replacement funds are often preempted by competing priorities. So in most of the agencies that I've come across, there is not a centralized place in which fleet is budgeted for, and oftentimes fleet replacement funding is handed out to different distributed offices throughout the organization or programs throughout the organization, and they have other priorities that they want to spend their funds on that they think are more appropriate. So sometimes fleet falls to the back burner in that case. Now conversely, GSA Fleet Leasing, the funds for those vehicles can't be diverted without vehicles being turned in. So if you're going to own the vehicle, you're going to receive a bill every month for the use of that vehicle, and GSA essentially handles the accumulation of capital needed to replace those vehicles in a timely manner. The agency must manage the fleet card system and acquire an FMIS or use the Fed FMS. And this is one of those indirect costs that I mentioned in the previous slide, the cost of implementing and managing a fleet card system and the cost of implementing and managing a fleet management information system, an FMIS. GSA Fleet, they've already built up their program to scale, and they have fleet card services and the use of GSA drive-through, which is part of the monthly lease rate. The agency can determine its own replacement cycles when you own your vehicles, assuming that you're beyond the federal minimums. And in those cases, for lower utilization vehicles, it may make sense to keep them for longer periods of time. You can kind of spread out your costs over a longer period in that way. GSA, on the other hand, they have established replacement standards for each vehicle class, and those are really in place to align with the monthly lease rates to make sure that they're pulling in enough monthly charges to cover the replenishment of the fleet and to buy new vehicles in a timely manner. And lastly, the agency can establish more control over maintenance or repair decisions with ownership, and this is especially important for agencies where they can't find it or they don't find it feasible to go out into the local market to buy maintenance or repair services from some sort of local repair shop. This often happens on installations or in remote areas where there just aren't enough local repair shops to cover the needs of the fleet. And with GSA Fleet Leasing, maintenance or repair is arranged through maintenance control centers. So they do handle a lot of that administrative effort that goes into finding repair shops and paying for repairs. Next slide, please. So NRCS has a few reasons for tackling the lease versus own question. And one of the primary reasons that folks really start looking at fleet replacement is that fleet age starts to creep up. And with fleet age increasing, you're also going to have a decrease in reliability and an increase in maintenance or repair costs. And of course, the folks that are using the vehicles are going to be less and less satisfied with the vehicles as they get older and older. And that's kind of, that's one part of it, as well as the inconsistency part that there's no continuous stream of funds being dedicated to fleet replacement to keep the fleet at the appropriate age. Some years there's better fleet replacement funding available than others. So there's a lot of inconsistency, and what folks often struggle with is trying to identify what the appropriate budget number is to spend year over year on fleet replacement to keep the fleet healthy. And that was kind of one of the goals of our analysis of the fleet. Secondly, there was an initiative, and it's still going on, within the Department of Agriculture to identify strategic sourcing. And that means essentially sourcing both fleet assets and other types of products and services in the most cost-effective manner possible. And it went across a wide range of areas, but fleet was one subset of that initiative. So that was another reason why we wanted to take a look at these fleet replacement practices. Another area is that within NRC itself, there was an administrative reorganization that essentially pulled some of the fleet management functions from the state level and at local office levels up to a national headquarters level organization, which is Adam's office. They have responsibility for a larger share of fleet card management and vehicle replacement than they did before. So, in order to support those different objectives or factors, NRCS had contracted with Mercury to calculate optimal replacement cycles for key classes of vehicles to determine how long vehicles should be kept in the fleet, to identify replacement eligible vehicles that would be advantageous to lease. So that's when we get into the lease versus buy analysis. We developed replacement plans or capital asset replacement plans that identified the funding levels for various scenarios of fleet replacement, whether we wanted to replace vehicles in accordance with the minimum standards or we would replace them at the optimal standards. Those all have different funding levels that would be associated with them, and we evaluated how those funding levels would affect the age of the fleet and future spending in upcoming budget cycles. We reported on the costs and benefits of each approach. So we calculated how much maintenance or repair would be affected by changes in fleet replacement spending. How much would fuel be affected by fleet replacement spending, those types of things. We provided a spreadsheet tool for making future lease versus buy decisions. So that's going back to that requirement where you have to compare the cost of ownership for a vehicle over the similar life cycle versus the cost of ownership for a GSA lease vehicle over a similar cycle. And we provided updated fleet replacement procedure documents to use as guidance. So essentially, we took everything that we learned during this process and developed a draft fleet replacement procedure handbook that the agency may be able to use in the future going forward with their ongoing requirements. Next slide, please. So the results of that effort was obviously the development of a long-range replacement strategy. We developed 2 reports, a procedures handbook, and some replacement plans that identified which vehicles in which offices should be purchased and approximately how much they would cost to be replaced. We identified lease versus buy determinations by vehicle across the fleet. We identified funding requirements for the next 10 years. We developed a replacement plan by vehicle with estimated costs. We identified those indirect costs. This is part of your vehicle level data reporting requirements from the Executive Order 13693, where you have to report indirect costs for every vehicle in the fleet. The federal standard or the alternative standard that's put in place is somewhere in the neighborhood of $468 per vehicle. Since NRCS does not have an in-house maintenance or repair operation, that most of the vehicles are normal passenger type vehicles like sedans and SUVs and pickup trucks. They kind of run a lean fleet management organization, so their indirect costs or their overhead costs for managing vehicles would be less than what you would see if you actually had to staff up shops and you had to provide mechanics and mechanic supervision and a parts inventory and things like that. So that's why that number is probably significantly less than what fleets would see if they had those types of operations. And then one of the interesting findings was that the replacement backlog would be reduced by about $30 million after doing a lease conversion on 2,100 vehicles. So we calculated the replacement backlog, and it was in the tens of millions. Obviously, that was discussed on the previous slide that the fleet age was creeping up, and part of that backlog was able to be eliminated by going with this alternative financing approach for replacing their fleet. Next slide, please. So we, in order to make these results stick, one of the parts of the replacement study was to develop a written procedure for fleet replacement. So we developed this document that you see on the right-hand side of your screen, the National Fleet Replacement Procedures Handbook. So we've delivered that to the NRCS, and they're going to work through the process of the procedures that have been laid out in that handbook, and then there's some discussion of actually incorporating that into an agency directive going forward. So we developed it. It covers those timelines and processes. That we also incorporated fast reporting milestones into the annual process. So the book is really organized around what you would do in each quarter of the year or each month of the year. What is your bulleted list of activities that you have to do as a fleet manager in order to keep the fleet moving forward in accordance with all the guidance? So we've established those as ideal guidelines, and what that's done for NRCS, using that as guidance has put them in a much more proactive position, and they're in a much better position this year than they were in previous years in terms of getting their ordering done, getting their fast reporting done, and things of that nature. Next slide, please. So ultimately, the recommendations from the study, based on current usage of the vehicles, that they replace approximately 1,200 vehicles with GSA Fleet leases. So not all of the vehicles in the fleet were calculated to be advantageous to switch over to leasing, and the major factor in that is the utilization level of the vehicles. Vehicles that are driven more tend to favor towards GSA Fleet leasing than vehicles that are driven less. For owned vehicles, increase replacement funding to ensure that vehicles are replaced in compliance with NRCS optimum cycles. So if you have a fleet replacement cycle that you're trying to accomplish, you need to fund the fleet at a certain level in order to be able to buy the vehicles as they're coming due for replacement. Otherwise, you're going to start accumulating a backlog. Follow the newly developed National Fleet Replacement Procedures Handbook to gain a more proactive footing. Use the results of the VAM as a default vehicle selection for replacements. So what this actually required in the procedures is that they reference back to their vehicle allocation methodology study, and that if there was a deviation from the field when a vehicle comes due for replacement, say the vehicle is an SUV and the optimal vehicle we determined could be a sedan, when they go to replace that SUV, they would have to provide a justification if they were to replace it with anything other than a sedan. They would have to go to a higher level in the organization for approval. So that's really trying to make those fleet right typing and right sizing determinations stick and be used as part of the plan moving forward. And then obviously our recommendation was that they continue to use a spreadsheet-based lease versus buy tool to evaluate vehicles as they come up for replacement. So just because a vehicle that we analyze today doesn't favor a replacement, if there's a change in the lease rate going forward, or if there's a change in the utilization of the vehicle, then it's possible that vehicle may switch categories and it may be more advantageous to lease in the future. So with that, on the next slide, I think it's turning back over to Adam. So he'll carry through to the end of the presentation. Thanks.
All right. Thank you very much, Scott. And what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to talk about our actual process that we went through in the NRCS. We'll get down into some of the details of what we actually went through for our leasing conversion that we've been at now for over a year. We started talking about this back in probably late calendar year 2015, I think it was. And as Scott mentioned in a previous slide, there was something called the Strategic Sourcing Initiative that was going on. And USDA at the department level did a bunch of studies. One of the studies they did was looking at more cost-effective ways to acquire fleet resources across the department. And one of the outcomes of that study was a recommendation to go to more leasing across the department. And so in the NRCS, what that looked like in the end was, as Scott mentioned, we decided to convert 2,100 of our vehicles from an owned to a leased status. So because we were doing so many, it wasn't maybe what you'd call a real traditional GSA conversion, and that's what I wanted to start with here, just to explain that traditionally, as I understand it, with a conversion effort with the GSA, it's also referred to as replating, meaning that the agency gives their own vehicle over to GSA, and basically GSA takes ownership of it and then leases it back to the agency. So while that may be a conversion in the traditional sense, we went about it a little bit differently. For the USDA conversion, there was an MOA that was signed between USDA and GSA, and underneath the terms of that MOA, GSA allowed agencies to keep our converted vehicles, or at least some of them, and then sell them on our own and keep the sales proceeds. So it's a little bit different in how we went about it this time, but it worked out well, and we appreciated the opportunity to sell our vehicles and retain the sales proceeds for them. So the way it worked for us then is that instead of giving GSA our owned vehicle, turning it over to them, and then them putting a GSA plate on it and then leasing it back to us, we kept our vehicles, ordered new ones from GSA. They began leasing us the new vehicles, and then we disposed of the old vehicles ourselves. So what GSA indicated to us is that their financial position that fiscal year and the fact that we were ordering so many vehicles at one time allowed them to take this path, although I don't know that that would be a possibility in every case. So what we did to start the process, we had lots of teleconferences, lots of discussions to just work this out. It was a major effort, and it was a lot of work over the last fiscal year, and is still going on, as we're going to talk about here in a little bit. But GSA and the NRCS set up ordering templates. So basically GSA gave us a big, long Excel spreadsheet and said, okay, here's the information that we're going to need from you if we're going to order a vehicle for you. And that's what we used. Those of you who are familiar with, excuse me, those of you who are familiar with GSA leasing already will be familiar with a system called CAM, which is a way that you usually would order a new vehicle for a GSA lease. But because these were brand new vehicles that we were ordering, we weren't able to do it that way. And so we just used Excel spreadsheets to capture all the ordering information. So we cooperated together to complete the following steps. We work with local drivers. So our fleet managers, the fleet managers on my branch, work with local drivers, local offices to pick the vehicle types and options that were desired. And even before that, I should mention that we had to determine in our fleet which vehicles that we were going to convert. And the department study that I referenced before and Mercury's study on a lease versus buy analysis helped us to get there to determine which vehicles would be the most cost-effective to turn over to a GSA lease. But we worked on those requirements with local drivers. We collected those requirements and put them on the spreadsheet, ordering templates, and sent those to GSA. We identified local POCs to work with GSA when they had questions. And so what we gave them with each vehicle order is also the name and the contact information of the local driver or local office information that they could contact if they had questions. And we're going to say a little bit more about this in a subsequent slide. There's a lesson learned that came with this as well, but that's what we did to let GSA know who they could contact if they had questions. GSA reviewed the order, made changes to it when necessary. If there was a certain vehicle that wasn't available, a certain options combination that wasn't available, they made those changes, gave it back to us for one more review. We, at that point, every time it changed hands and went back and forth, we made some updates to it. GSA then did one final review, and then they gave it back to us for a final signature by the USDA Fleet Manager and the NRCS Fleet Manager. After that, then, we were able to, after our signature on the order, GSA sent the order to the vehicle manufacturers, and then we entered into the delivery phase. So when a vehicle was delivered and ready, we received notification from the GSA FSR that the vehicle was at the marshalling location available for pickup, and then we worked with the local office to let them know that the vehicle was available so they can go and pick up their vehicle. At the marshalling location where the new vehicle was ready, there was a form called a vehicle accountability form that was filled out and signed in every case by the GSA representative at the marshalling location and the NRCS employee who was picking up the vehicle. And we collected all those vehicle accountability forms in my branch. Then we got into installation after we actually had the vehicle, installing accessory equipment if that was necessary. So the NRCS does a lot of field work. We have a lot of pickups, and a lot of those pickups require either toppers or toolboxes, bed liners, and sometimes some other equipment as well. But we have a lot of tools that we need to take out to the field to do our work, and so toppers and toolboxes are sometimes necessary. So we also had to work with GSA to install accessory equipment like that. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later too in the lessons learned slide, but there's different ways that you can go about adding aftermarket equipment to a GSA leased vehicle. GSA allows an agency to add that equipment yourself if you get approval from them first, and so you can buy the equipment and get it installed yourself if you'd like, or GSA will purchase that equipment for you and then bill you back for it. And there's 2 different methods there. So we had to work through all that, and we're still working through all that right now to make sure that the vehicles are in the configuration necessary for the field to be able to use them. And then, as I said, we were able to keep at least a large portion of the vehicles that we converted ourselves and dispose of them ourselves. So that was kind of the last phase of all this. We had to dispose of all of our vehicles that we were converting, and we're still going through that process right now. So this may be the most important part of the presentation. I just wanted to share some of the lessons learned as we went through this process. So I mentioned before that we identified local POCs that really were local to GSA that they should work with if they had questions. And at the start, GSA indicated to us that their normal process was to work with the local drivers, the people themselves who actually use the vehicles. And I think they like doing that. I think part of their customer service model is to be decentralized to the point where they can work directly with drivers and be local enough to be able to work through issues with them. And that's a good thing. But what we found out was that in our case, it really didn't work very well for the actual drivers or the local offices to be the points of contact, at least in the ordering phase for the vehicle, because the local offices didn't necessarily have authority to make decisions on what types of vehicles to order and what options to get. So they may have had significant input to that decision, but what we found is that if they don't have authority to make the final decision, it can cause some disconnects, because they could tell an FSR they want something or prefer something, and the FSR could start acting on that information, but only to find out that at higher headquarters in the NRCS, that wasn't really necessary. So we found that it actually worked better for the GSA FSRs to work directly with our fleet managers, the people on my branch who manage fleet, and that just worked a whole lot better for us. And we're working towards making that change now as we continue to go through the process. We also found that it was just really essential to have a really organized and thorough review process. As I'm sure most of you folks know, when you're ordering a vehicle, just for one vehicle, there's a whole bunch of details that you have to work out. There's all sorts of different options and combinations that you can go with just for one vehicle. And as Scott mentioned earlier, we ended up converting about 2,100 vehicles. So when you have that many vehicles you're working through and that many details on each vehicle that you have to get right, it can get really complicated and really complex really quickly. So I think we did a pretty good job at this, but it was a lot of work, and it's just acknowledgement, I guess, that if you're going through something like this, you got to really make sure that you keep good control over the different spreadsheet versions that are going back and forth, and that you have either one person or a few key people that are keeping tabs of all that and making sure that the orders are correct as they're going back and forth from us to GSA. We also discovered that a new leased vehicle to get the delivery takes anywhere between 1 to 4 months. And, you know, I think that's, for those of you who purchase vehicles through GSA Auto Choice, you probably find that that's similar to your experience, but that's not necessarily a problem. You just have to know going into it that after the vehicle order goes to the manufacturers, it still could be a little while before you actually get your vehicle. Another thing we discovered, that marshaling locations across the country are limited. So GSA's model, as I understand it, in order to save costs, and I understand this, they have a limited number of marshaling locations across the country. They have quite a few of them, but of course it's a big country, and so when you look at the marshaling locations that they have, in some cases there may only be 1 or 2 marshaling locations in any given state, and then in some cases there may not even be a marshaling location within a state, if it's a smaller state or if there's other marshaling locations that are right across the state border in another state. So this is just something that kind of caught us off guard, I guess, and we just had to work through it. In the end, I think it ended up working okay, but what it meant was that some of our drivers had to end up going a significant distance to pick up their new leased vehicle. And in some cases, maybe even up to 4 hours one way to go get a vehicle, and maybe even more. But GSA did work with us in some cases, and one thing that helped us out is the next bullet. I wanted to mention that direct delivery is a possibility for a GSA leased vehicle. So if you get a new vehicle through GSA Fleet, what they can do is they can deliver that vehicle directly to your garage location. And that's a good option in some cases. However, you have to pay for it. And what we found is that in some cases, the lowest amount that we found to get a vehicle directly delivered was right around $50. But it went up from there. In some cases, it cost several $100s to get a vehicle delivered directly to your location. So again, it's a good option and sometimes comes in handy, but you do have to pay GSA back for that service. So planning for your aftermarket items, your accessories like your bed liners or your toolboxes or your toppers, you do need to plan ahead for that. So as I mentioned before, GSA Fleet allows an agency to add equipment like that yourself if you choose to. You do have to get approval from the GSA FSR, but you can add those items yourself. If you need to, of course, you need to be planning ahead and thinking about what vendors you need to go to get that equipment, planning for the installation, scheduling the installation, making sure you have a payment mechanism in place to do that if you're doing that yourself. If you're wanting GSA to help you with that and to pay for those installations themselves, that can be a good option for you, especially if you lack maybe the purchasing mechanisms or the contracting mechanisms to get that equipment yourself, because they go ahead and pay for it themselves and then they just bill you back for it. But what we found is that this just doesn't happen on its own, and you have to plan for it. And you have to work closely with your FSR to make sure that this actually happens. And in order to get the vehicle ready for the field and to make sure that it's actually usable for them, it's really beneficial to think ahead and to have that conversation with your FSR, maybe even before the vehicle hits the ground, and to be planning ahead for it. If GSA buys the equipment for you, what we have been able to ask them to do in some cases is to help arrange the vendors and to look for some vendors and to supply some vendors for you that you can take the vehicle to. But I kind of got the impression going through it that that wasn't the typical type of activity that a GSA FSR would do. And so they were good in stepping up and agreeing to help us a little bit more when we asked for it, but it was a bit of a struggle to get some of these accessories going. But again, there's a lesson learned, and we just know now that we have to plan for it a little bit better. So enough on that. I want to move to the next thing. What you're going to find as well if you work with GSA is that like any big organization, they're still working on some efficiencies. And overall, I have to say that our interactions with GSA have been great, and they've been very cooperative and great to work with. But they're still an organization that's working on some efficiencies as well. And there are some differences between GSA zone to zone and how they handle different things. So whether it's a form maybe that they use for approving one matter or another, or just in how they approach different situations, what you'll find is that different GSA FSRs will approach things a little bit differently. And that's one thing that we identified and had to get used to. And we've talked with GSA about it, and to their credit, they've said, yeah, this is something that we're working on, and I know GSA is working on more standardization across their organization, but it is something just to be aware of. It's absolutely essential to make sure that your drivers, when they're going to pick up a GSA leased vehicles, have clear instructions. I think we did a pretty good job at this, but when you have that many vehicles that you're picking up, inevitably you're going to have a driver who is confused on what to do or confused how to use the new GSA fleet card, because using that GSA leasing fleet card is different than using our fleet card for our own vehicles. And so we had to make sure that we were explaining things well to our drivers in that regard. So just a few more lessons learned here for you. And this first one on this slide, I just have to really emphasize. It's really important to make sure that your financial community is engaged when it comes to starting a new GSA lease. And that's because from a fleet manager perspective, you can do all that you do with helping the office pick the right vehicle, making sure the options are lined up, getting the order to GSA, make sure they understand how to use the fleet card, but you got to pay GSA for that vehicle. And making sure that your financials are lined up within your agency to be able to pay GSA when the bills start coming through is really important. And so each agency, of course, will be different. You have your own financial systems, but your accountants and your financial managers who will oversee all that, it's really important to bring them in sooner rather than later to make sure that they're prepared to help get GSA paid for the new lease vehicle. Having a plan for your BOACs. A BOAC is a 6-digit code that GSA uses and assigns to every vehicle. And I won't get too deep into this, but you just have to make sure that you have that discussion with GSA and make sure you have a BOAC identified for each vehicle as it's entering into your fleet. The AFV surcharge is something that we have within the USDA, and it is something that other agencies might be dealing with as well. What this is that certain alternative fuel vehicles cost more for GSA to procure. And so to offset the cost of that, what they've done in the USDA, what we've done in the USDA is we've added a surcharge to every vehicle that we lease from GSA to spread that cost out to account for the cost of increased cost for some alternative fuel vehicles, especially your hybrid and electric vehicles. And so that's just something to be aware of and to make sure that your offices know about as a cost that's going to be assigned to each GSA leased vehicle. The extra options that you order on your vehicle could increase your monthly rate and sometimes even your mileage rate. So just be aware of that. The rates that GSA will quote to you are for just the standard base option as you order a vehicle, the standard package. If you order other things like increased engine size or even things like your trailer hitch, trailer wiring options and things like that, that could add a fee to your monthly rate. So you just have to be aware of that. Training for your drivers is essential, and we did this. We had GSA provide training for our drivers. We had 2 sessions that were well attended. Especially if you have a driver who's used to operating an owned vehicle and now they're getting into a GSA leased vehicle, there's some differences there. So making sure they understand the differences is really important. We learned that as well. And then training required for some of the systems you're going to have to use for GSA leasing, like drive-through and VCSS. That's really important as well. And GSA was good to provide training in both of those systems to us. Okay, we're getting close to wrapping it up here. Just a few more slides to finish with. This slide I won't get too deeply into. I just wanted to share with you some of the numbers from within our fleet to show what a big effort this was for us to undertake this leasing conversion. In FY14, we purchased 614 owned vehicles. FY15 was a few more than that, around 900. In FY16, though, when we started this leasing conversion, we also bought some vehicles. We purchased some owned vehicles that year as well, 375. But we ordered right around 1,800 vehicles through this leasing conversion in FY16, and then we still have some orders to make yet this fiscal year to finish our leasing conversion and to get us up to that 2,100 vehicle number that we're going to get to for leased vehicles. Go to the next slide. Okay, these next few slides, what I just wanted to talk about is a little bit is that because we did this leasing conversion, it's making this year a little bit interesting for us for our vehicle replacement planning. And so there's 3 different things that we're having to go through this year for vehicle replacements. And we'll talk about each of these 3 in the next 3 slides. So the first one I'll go over is that we have some vehicle replacements that we have to make for some of the vehicles that we leased from GSA before the leasing conversion. So in the NRCS fleet, we have right around 8,700 vehicles, and before our leasing conversion last fiscal year that we started, we had already about 270 of those vehicles that were already leased from GSA. And so, the way GSA does it is that they notify you when you have a leased vehicle that's ready for replacement. And for us in FY 2017, 43 of those vehicles are due for replacement this year. So Scott talked a little bit about our reorganization in our agency and how my branch now does most of the fleet management for our agency. And before, in the CAM module, orders were done by local offices, but now my branch is handling that this year. And so we're working through that, and we're getting input from the local offices on the vehicle types that they want for these 43 vehicles for the replacements. Again, as Scott mentioned before, requiring offices to consider the VAM recommendation for that vehicle replacement and then to provide justification if they're needing to go outside of what the VAM recommends. Of course, taking care of our functional needs exemption documentation for vehicles that we're getting that are not low greenhouse gas vehicles, and then routing those vehicles through national headquarters for approval. We also have to finish our leasing conversion. As I mentioned earlier, we have about 285 vehicles that we still have to convert. And GSA has indicated to us that they're going to want to order these vehicles for us in the March to April timeframe. So what we're looking at is we're going to, we've already identified these vehicles and actually identified what type of vehicles we want to order, but we're going to have to review that again. GSA is going to have to review those orders again to make sure they look okay. Final signature from our fleet manager and then the department fleet manager with orders going out probably in the April timeframe and then deliveries occurring in the April to July timeframe. We'll be issuing a national bulletin internally within the agency to explain this process. We also have all of our remaining owned vehicles. We've got 6,500 or so vehicles that are going to remain owned in our fleet, and so we have to think about replacements for that portion of our fleet as well. And Mercury assisted us with identifying the good candidates for replacement in our own fleet for this fiscal year. With an estimated cost of $17.6 million. There's around 700 vehicles that we're going to have to replace this fiscal year. That's what we're looking at right now. And again, the estimated cost for that is going to be right around $17.6 million. We are going to evaluate, though, those vehicles via lease versus buy analysis to see what's going to be best from a cost perspective, whether it's going to be leasing that vehicle over the life cycle or buying that vehicle. This is just a little bit more on what we're envisioning for this process for replacing our own vehicles. Again, like I said, Mercury did a study for us. We do have some recommendations to start with on what vehicles that we're going to replace, but the local offices, the states, are going to be making have a significant influence upon that decision on what specific vehicles to replace, so we'll get their input as well. We'll be looking at the VAM recommendation for every vehicle, lease versus buy, like I mentioned, routing every replacement through our national headquarters for review, still doing our functional needs exemptions for vehicles that are not low greenhouse gas vehicles, looking at ordering those vehicles around the May timeframe, and then again we'll have a national bulletin to explain this process within our agency internally. So just in summary, I know that was a lot to go through in a short amount of time, and hopefully I didn't go too fast through some of that. But really, GSA leasing can be an attractive option for many agencies, especially if you're in a situation like us where you've got some replacement backlog and you have a large number of vehicles that are maybe getting really, really old, and maybe to replace those vehicles, it would take a lot of money if you actually purchased them outright. So if you need to get some new vehicles in your fleet quickly, but you don't have a whole lot of capital or a whole lot of cash on hand to do that, GSA leasing can definitely be an attractive option. And in some cases, GSA leasing can definitely save you costs over the life cycle, but an analysis is required to determine that. Successful leasing conversion requires careful planning, oversight, and close coordination with GSA Fleet. with that, I think I will go ahead and turn it over to the question phase of our presentation.